Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the new season of our seminar series running from August to December 2024. This event is brought to you in partnership with the Congressional Policy and Budget Research Department, or CPBRD, with participation from representatives of various House committees and distinguished members of the House of Representatives, or HREP. We are excited to have you with us as we embark on another round of engaging and impactful discussions. As part of the recently concluded HREP Ateneo Evidence-Based Research Project, 13 research studies were submitted to the Philippines House of Representatives. These studies, packaged as the Special Working Paper Series under the Ateneo Department of Economics and Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development, or ASERD, cover a wide range of topics designed to support the Marcos Jr. administration's 8-point agenda. These include initiatives aimed at protecting the purchasing power of families, reducing vulnerability and mitigating the pandemic's effects, ensuring sound macroeconomic fundamentals, creating more quality and green jobs, facilitating government right-sizing, and establishing peace and order. We will have a 40-minute presentation followed by a 20-minute Q&A, providing ample opportunity for in-depth discussion. Just a quick reminder, though the House rules were already shown earlier, let me run through them again briefly. First, please let the speaker finish the presentation before we open the floor for questions. For our Zoom participants, kindly stay muted and keep your video off during the entire presentation. When we move into the Q&A, simply raise your hand virtually, and once acknowledged, you can unmute and ask your question. Alternatively, you can also send us your questions via the chat box or chat with me directly. Lastly, materials from this seminar will only be shared on our website with the speaker's consent. Next slide, please. So for today's presentation titled Development of a Fiscal-Centric DSGE Model in Aid of Policy Evaluation, introduces a dynamic stochastic general equilibrium or DSGE model aimed at analyzing fiscal policy in the Philippines. It utilizes Bayesian methods and macroeconomic data from 22 to 2021 to explore the effects of unexpected economic shocks, providing valuable insights into the fiscal multipliers across different scenarios. This paper offers an in-depth look at fiscal dynamics during the past three administrations and examines how fiscal and monetary policies interact, ultimately contributing to economic stabilization. Our key speaker for today's presentation is Dr. Lawrence Dacoycoy. Dr. Lawrence Dacoycoy has an extensive background in economics with degrees from both Kyoto University and the University of the Philippines. He is currently a full professor at the De La Salle University and has made significant contributions to research, specifically in applied econometrics, social mobility, and fiscal policy modeling. His work using dynamic stochastic general equilibrium or DSGE models is particularly relevant in addressing key economic and labor issues for today. Please join us in welcoming our distinguished speaker with a warm round of applause. Dr. Dacoycoy, the
Yeah,
floor is yours.
thank you very much, Dr. Magante, and thank you to those who opted to participate in this seminar. So I'm grateful to the Ateneo Economics Department for sponsoring this seminar. And as mentioned by Dr. Magante, the presentations came from our engagement with the CPBRD of the House of Representatives. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is something that you can read. Okay, the Department of Economics in Ateneo has already published the working papers several months ago. Um, so I'm here to share with you some of the insights that you can derive from this presentation or from the working paper. And I know that most students think that macro is hard. Well, if you want to torment yourself, maybe it is, no? So I'm using the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium modeling framework. And I share the views of my colleagues that there are other modeling frameworks that you can use in order to explore fiscal policy dynamics. But then this is just one of them. And so that's the reason why I have to focus on what it can do as far as uncovering, okay, to what extent will it be able to uncover the issues associated with fiscal policy. Okay, so let me begin. So this is how this talk, so it's going to last for about 30 to 40 minutes. So I will start with an overview and then proceed to the model. So it's not going to be extensively discussed anymore. After all, these types of models, they require careful study. So what I'm going to do is to surface some practical aspects for you to take advantage of. So the model is an open economy DSG model, but then I'm going to focus more on some of the key aspects of the model. And from your basic lessons in economics, of course, when you have an open economy model and what you're going to do research on is the small economy like the Philippines, you tend to, to declare as exogenous certain processes that only exist outside of the Philippines. It's a shortcut, but then I think it may work. So because I'm going to focus more on the Philippine economy, it's like we are discussing a closed economy issue, but then there may be some external aspects that I'm going to bring in order to complete the discussion. So I'll talk about calibration and estimation. So again, these are technical issues or technical steps in any formal modeling. So again, I will focus on the intuition. And then after that, I will talk about some results and conclude. Okay. Okay, so what the paper is all about, no? So first, it highlights an estimable DSGE model that was developed during the period of engagement with CPBRD. So the engagement ended in March this year. So it means that it rested for a while before it was resurrected. Okay, and then the model has already been estimated, but as far as the literature, as far as the practice of modeling is concerned, you really have to continuously subject your model to certain robustness checks. And what I'm going to present now, of course, the structure is still there, but then I'm going to use a subsample focusing on the period 2010 to 2020, not 2021, it's up to 2023. So the model um, is a typical dynamic macroeconomic model. So meaning we avoided the specification of ad hoc specifications or behavioral equations. There's nothing wrong with them. It's just that they don't fit as part of the framework. In a DSG model, you have to specify optimal conditions. You have to allow agents to maximize utility, for firms to maximize profits within a dynamic environment. Okay, that sets it apart. It's because whatever they did in the past has a way to come back and then bite those who decided. And the model is quite complex. It's because you have difference equations, and then you're going to optimize. So you're going to employ Bellman equations, dynamic optimization methods, etc. So usually people say that, well, it's hard to understand, but then this is just a reflection of something that we're already familiar with, the typical optimization problems in micro that we've already encountered. Okay, so the model is seen as a data generating process. Of course, there will be hits and misses, and that's the reality in macroeconomic modeling. But then we're using Bayesian methodologies. So it's not ad hoc, meaning there's a way for us to estimate parameters by exploiting our prior beliefs and, of course, the likelihood or the information that we can extract from the data. So again, this afternoon, it's all about, the core would be fiscal policy. And it's easier, I think, than monetary policy. Okay, so we're going to undertake some fiscal policy simulations, so which means that we we shock a particular exogenous variable and then allow the shock to be transmitted throughout the model. And then we pick one uh, variable or outcome and then we interpret it. So that's the IRF, the impulse response function. And then the DSGE, for those who are not yet familiar with it, it's a model that is more suitable for explaining business cycle fluctuations. So you in a model that focuses on the long run, okay, so we are not interested in the outcomes there. It's because when you talk about inflation, when you talk about fiscal policy, the objectives are usually um, they pertain to short run stabilization policy. Okay, so we're not going to forecast. That's a major hurdle when it comes to DSG models. But then we're just a step away from formally um undertaking a forecast. Okay. So there are also empirical questions that are central to the functioning of a macroeconomy. For instance, you ask the question, how many times do firms change their prices in a year? Okay, so maybe you have data for that, you have survey data, and then you will be able to give an exact figure. But then in a model, it's very difficult to estimate that parameter. It's because it has to be formally established. Okay, I mean the mechanisms that will allow you to say, aha, this is how firms are able to determine their prices optimally. This is how some firms are not able to price their goods optimally. So therefore, they resort to other rule of thumb decision rules. Okay, and you have to, from there, you try to, okay, understand the pricing dynamics. So again, it's hard, right? It's hard if you rely on other methods. And my view is that whatever estimates you produce, they can serve as the start of a validating or validation exercise. So what does that mean? So suppose you found out that the the proportion of those who cannot optimize is too low. So that's a valid starting point. You ask yourself, is this really correct? So can I look at is there a way for me to look at the statistics that will allow me to say that, well, transfers are, efficiently distributed to non-optimizing households or vulnerable households. So DSGEs can do that. So another one is, for instance, you would like to determine the response of fiscal policy to changes in debt, the response of fiscal policy to changes in growth conditions, then you'll be able to establish that as well. But for me, the most important attribute of a DSG model is its ability to identify shocks. Okay, and then of course you may say we have the vector autoregressive model, we have the SVAR even. So maybe there's a more practical way of estimating shocks, but you're dealing with a large model here. And then for the SVAR, even the Bayesian VAR, I don't know if you've heard about it, the Bayesian VAR has a weakness. It's very hard to identify or give the shocks names or label them. It's because it's not formally motivated within the model. So again, I reviewed the literature. Of course, there are pros, there are cons, but it's really up to us to figure out how we can use a modeling procedure such as the DSGE. So the DSG model, which has very strong fiscal attributes, can also help you estimate multiplier effects. I've estimated several multiplier effects, but then they're not going to be presented here. And remember, you're dealing with a model for the macroeconomy. So the multiplier is only valid within the model. So when you present your multiplier and then people will say, ang baba naman, it's too low, or maybe that's reflected by the dynamics of the model. By the way, the multiplier works like this. If you increase your expenditure, government consumption expenditure by 1 peso or $1, then the output may increase by more than that. So you say you're very happy. So I was able to multiply my 1 peso several times and everybody's happy. And then they will approve that budget item. That's how multipliers can be deployed. Another one is that there are dynamic processes that take time to before becoming useful. And one of these is what is known as the time to build process. So if you set up a plant, it's not going to happen that, after a while the plant will become operational. It may take 5 years. And because the plant will give you, let's say, energy, okay, the benefits will start pouring or coming in after it was deemed operational. But then you're already investing in the plant. So that can also be captured by the model. And there are a lot of policy instruments. I've seen some DSG models that made use of exciting and innovative policy instruments. if you're going to use other models, it may be difficult. It's because these policy instruments can only be properly described over time in terms of their effectiveness. Okay, and then the model is capable of incorporating implementation delays, okay, involving public projects. And of course, when we talk about the SGE fiscal, we always have an eye on public debt dynamics, the role of fiscal rules, and of course, stabilization policies. Okay, so relative to the working paper that came out or was published by the Department of Economics in Ateneo, okay, this one focuses on the subsample 2010 quarter two up to 2023 quarter four. And through the help of our CPBRD colleagues, the government investment data that was used uh, have been replaced by the disbursement data that reflected government investments. So these are interesting questions that pertain to um, the macroeconomy. So for instance, you ask the question, are public and private goods complementary? Okay, if you have access to a survey data, then it means that you can identify whether a particular household is consuming both public and private goods, and then you're going to estimate their degree of complementarity. That's tough. Okay, but then in the model, that is something that can be estimated. Does public capital complement private capital? So we expect that the private sector and public sector should work hand in hand in order to improve economic efficiency, but then that is also something that is difficult to measure the degree of complementarity. And then you ask the question, how high is the proportion of non-optimizing household in the macroeconomy? This is also hard. It's because you have to be able to identify who are the optimizing and non-optimizing households if you have survey data. And we go to the next one, are fiscal rules is still relevant? The answer to this is, of course they are. Okay. But when you say fiscal rules, your stakeholders are going to consist of or made up of policymakers. So they will ask you serious questions. They will ask you what your estimates are and your degree of confidence in each of them. Okay, so and then I added the fifth question: do public investments mitigate inflation? And how do we do it? How do we know that public investments can actually help um, reduce the volatility of inflation? Well, inflation is usually is the prime to contain inflation. The BSP increases the policy rate, right? But during uncertain times, it may fall short. Okay, especially when there are supply factors, no? Or the supply factors are the ones responsible for causing inflationary spikes. So I'm going to show you a slide later that shows that investments can mitigate. No? Okay, and then in the model, we have firms, and these are firms who have production functions augmented by permanent and transitory technology shocks. And I'm going to show you some estimates of the shocks based on the um, based on the model. And then, okay, you've probably estimated AR-based models. So these are the autoregressive models um, using ARIMA method, etc. Okay, so what do you think? Is government consumption more persistent than government investments? So meaning if you're going to look for a budgetary item to put your money in or to invest in, what are you going to do? Is it government consumption or government investment? So it has something to do about the persistence of effects emanating from the shock. Okay. Okay, so the model is a medium scale fiscal-centric DSGE model. It's an open economy, but then for today's discussion, we'll just focus on the closed economy, some of the closed economy issues. So the households in this economy, we call it artificial economy, by the way, artificial. No? So when you deal with the DSG model, you have an artificial economy, so which means that there are model variables, right? But it doesn't stop there. It's not purely theoretical. So it means that there must be a way for you to connect the variables that you observe in the model to the variables that you can actually measure. Okay, so that's one of the strengths of the DSGE uh, um, model. Okay, so there are two types of households, one Vicardian and non-Vicardian. The Vicardian households, these are your optimizers. I should have just put optimizers there and then readily you can understand it, right? But there are uh, households that are not, that cannot optimize, meaning the reason for this is that if they receive their wages today, okay, they're going to spend all of it. Okay, so meaning they're not really in a good position to invest. So they don't participate, they don't access financial markets, they don't deposit their money in banks, etc. So they don't maximize. They're not forward-looking agents. Okay, so in an economy, it's like you are going to introduce two types of households, those who cannot optimize and then those who can. Okay, so that's heterogeneity, but then it's a low-level heterogeneity being introduced in the model. And then you have firms in the model. So there are a number of them, different types of firms. So we have the intermediate goods firms. So these are firms that produce intermediate goods and they serve domestic and international markets. Okay, but then what do intermediate goods producing firms do? They produce goods that can be used by final goods firms, because what final goods firms will do is simply to collect all of these intermediate inputs in order to assemble or manufacture a product. So we're talking in a very abstract manner. So it doesn't reflect an industry practice. It doesn't reflect what's actually going on. But then we know from theory that there are firms that will produce intermediate goods that will be used to complete the production process. And those who will complete it are called the final goods producing firms. And then there are three types of final goods producing firms. You have consumption goods, those that are producing consumption goods. What do? They bundle using the CES technology. I hope that you can still recall the constant elasticity of substitution technology or production function. So that's their production function. They combine imported with domestically produced goods. They combine them together and then they're able to produce what is known as the consumption good. And then you have the investment good. Okay, it's they go through the same process, and then public goods as well. Okay, so in this economy, so there is this deliberate move to model all the way. So which means that, well, it becomes rich, yes. It becomes consistent with optimization-based theories. But then later on, when you try to generate uh, results, you also have to be mindful that the model will work well if you're able to identify or match the data uh, to the pertinent variables in the model. And then in the model structure, you will also find the fiscal policy block. So you have your revenue and expenditure fiscal tools. And then for monetary policy, we just employed the Taylor rule. Okay, so there are other features. Output incorporates composite capital. So what does this mean? So if there are delays in the implementation of government projects, so it means that output will be lower because output depends on composite capital. But then more importantly, since composite capital is made up of public and private capital, the government has a role to play in improving output or in increasing output. So therefore, the government is also able to influence marginal costs. And in a monopolistically competitive setting, firms are able to price above marginal costs, right? Then that's essentially the markup. So there are markup shocks which may contribute to higher inflation. So that's the idea. Okay. And then there are two types of frictions in any DSGE model. You have nominal and real. So nominal frictions, so these are they come from the staggered price and wage adjustments. So think about it this way. In a classical setting, if there's a change in supply, if you're talking about the labor market, then the wage will instantaneously change in order to reflect a new equilibrium, right? Well, that doesn't happen, right? In a dynamic setting, there will be staggered wage adjustments. So it will reach equilibrium, that's for sure, but then it will not do it in a snap. Okay. Okay, what are real fictions? So these are fictions that emanate from habits, from various adjustment costs integrated as part of the model. So they pertain to utilization related costs, production of investment and consumption goods. The rationale is like this. If you are producing and then you're comfortable producing at a particular level, then you know exactly what your costs are. But then when you try to ramp up production, for instance, you'll be forced to hire more workers, you'll be forced to buy more equipment. And what does that do? It introduces adjustment costs. Okay, so that's a potential source of real frictions in the model. So I talked about households a while ago. So in this model, households have market power. So think of them as a skilled households. So when they go to the employment center, they will say, okay, we know that we can do something. We have a spatial ability, so give us a higher wage. So that will happen. And then there are also households who are not able to do that. Okay, so we're just introducing heterogeneity in the model. It is because it's a good mechanism to at least incorporate the dynamics that we would like to have. It pales in comparison to models that is specialized using cross-sectional data because there you have heterogeneity. In here, it's being forced. Okay, but then we cannot deny that the DSG model relies on micro concepts. Okay, so it's just that the decisions are being done in a more dynamic environment, and there are shocks, which introduces the feature of having stochastic effects. Okay, so you also have consumption and capital complementary. So both public and private consumption goods enter the individual's utility function. So by the way, this is DSGE, so it's a representative agent model. Okay, so again, be mindful of the assumptions. It's because if some of them are not appealing to you, there are other models developed within the DSGE framework that offer much more or that can readily admit the feature of heterogeneity. Okay, and then you have also transfers to households. So remember, you have transfers, pensions, etc. That can also be modeled as part of the fiscal block. And then you have government expenditures, you have fiscal rules, and then of course you have shocks. And these are equations. Okay, it's well, let me tell you a secret. It is much easier to derive all of this than to carry out the empirics. Okay, because it's you're going to do it at another level, that's for sure. Okay, why did I say that? It's because as economics professionals or as learners in economics, we have developed the ability to derive key equations. So if you're able to replicate or derive the equations that came out in a paper, that kind of skill can easily be replicated in deriving similar results based on other papers. But then when you try to estimate, there are a lot of considerations to be mindful of. Okay, so let me just highlight the practical intuition that you can derive. Since this is a dynamic model, there must be a way for us to connect what happened in the past or previous decisions to be made in the future. So that is given by the Euler equation. And how do you know that it is a dynamic equation? Well, it's because the components, take a look at this. This is time t minus 1. And then there's another consumption component that is CT. So that's dynamic, right? We're talking about the same variable observed in two different periods. So this is the non-Ricardian household consumption. So the Euler equation is associated with optimizing households for the non-Ricardian household consumption. This is, of course, the consumption that will be achieved by the non-optimizers. And there's a transfer rule. Okay, so you're essentially looking for the value of this parameter such that you're able to equalize these two, okay, in a dynamic fashion. And again, if this one is, let's say, 0.5, then the non-recurrent households will get their fair share of transfers. But then suppose this is 0.9, then it means that for the Ricardian households, those who are indexed by J, they only get 10%. Okay. And then we have conditions for optimal pricing in the domestic market. So it's a first order condition. But then the idea is there are firms who are able to optimize and there are firms that are unable to optimize. So you have to factor that in creating or setting up the optimization problem. For monopolistically competitive firms, price becomes a choice variable, right? In basic micro, we're used to deriving optimization problems, looking for the quantity that will maximize profits, right? But then that's for the perfectly competitive firm. But then for this one, you have to the firm is able to maximize profits based on um, prices. And this is the structure of the fiscal rule. So this is a fiscal rule specified generically. This is used to measure persistence of the fiscal policy shock. These are output effects or response of the fiscal policymaker to changes in output. And these are debt effects represented by this parameter theta FPB, which is connected to the debt in period T minus 1 or one period ago. And you have pre-announcement effects being captured by the model. In fiscal policy making, um, people will figure out what our um, congressmen are discussing while in session. So if they're discussing something about an impending increase in the tax rate, then people will know, and then they will act accordingly. Okay, so you have to capture that dynamic. And then we have, this is just an example. This is the government consumption rule, and then you have transfer rule. And the DSG model relies on the Taylor rule. So it doesn't have banks. Okay, so if you're looking for banks, they're not here. It doesn't have financial shocks, so they're not here as well. So this one is specialized for analyzing fiscal policy dynamics. And then you have public capital. So normally we have capital, the laws of motion, they call it the laws of motion of private capital, but then in here, you now introduce government capital. This is called authorized budget shock. Okay, it's a shock that actually influence public capital stock. And then you have here government investments. So they are a function of um, authorized budgets. Yung authorized budget, yun lang yung nasa GAA, yung GAA, General Appropriations Act. If that suddenly changes, then of course, the shock will be transmitted throughout the macroeconomy. So what are our empirical targets? So we need to derive or to estimate the posterior distribution of parameters. So the posterior is essentially proportional to the likelihood function times the prior distribution of the parameters. It's no longer easy, just like what we're doing with or in regression. Okay, in here, the likelihood is not known. The target distribution is not known yet either. So you have to rely on simulation procedures in order to at least be able to determine the posterior distribution. And then we're going to generate impulse response functions. And I hope that we can learn from the shocks. Okay, I'm going to show that in a while. And I wasn't able to do this, but then I was able to do it in um, another forum. Okay, but then it's feasible to estimate multipliers. So this is the model in a nutshell. As far as the decomposition is concerned, you have 95 variables, you have 81 estimable parameters, you have 33 shocks, etc. Okay, so these are the state variables. Think of it this way. So if you're modeling a macroeconomy and then you only have three outcomes, inflation, output growth, and then interest rate, right? But then you're dealing with a macroeconomy. So there are other states there that are not formally modeled. So that may complicate, no? That may complicate the ability of the model to explain the dynamics in a macroeconomy if something is not done um, accounting for the states. So for instance, capital accumulation will allow you to improve your um, stock of capital. So that is a state variable, but it's not shown in the model. But something like that will affect productivity, therefore it will also affect output. Okay. So these are the sources. I use the OpenStats from the PSA. And then there are also other useful databases from the Banco Central. This one is good for getting oil prices. And then, of course, you have the IMF. And there's also this Department of Finance's statistical database. So these are the shocks that are present in the model. Okay. And so there are a lot. Okay. And then, so what I'm going to do this afternoon is to just focus on a handful of them. Okay, so now let's focus on the questions that have been posed a while back. Okay, so here they are. So I'm going to answer each of them in a while. Okay, so what does the model say about the non-Ricardian households? Well, so you have here, this is essentially the proportion of non-Ricardian households in the model, so it's too low. Okay, so if you're going to take a look at consumption in the aggregate, well, that can be attributable to optimizers. Okay, so remember I told you that, this is always a work in progress. Okay, so in previous estimates, the estimate for omega is much higher. But then there's also, this one is interesting because it delivered a higher value for the parameter in the transfer rule. So it's not 50-50, it's 74. Think of it this way, 74% in favor of optimizers. Okay. Now let's move on to the second one. How do we characterize domestic firms? So they can be characterized in terms of the number of times they are able to change their prices in a year. Okay, so the critical parameter here is the psi age. It's essentially the probability that a firm is not able to adjust its prices optimally per period. Okay, so it's 0.58, but then when you ask, okay, is this plausible? The answer to that is, well, you have to take a look. You have to compute the number of times that this type of firm is able to change its prices in a year. Okay, so definitely the one that is specializing in exports will be forced to change its prices more frequently than the one specializing in the domestic market. Now, this is what I really wanted to show. So you have three administrations. Of course, you have two of them completed their respective terms. So you have government investment shock here, and then you have the government consumption shock. So these are estimated through what is known as the Kalban smoother. So you have the government investment. Just take a look. It's more volatile. Well, actually, they're both volatile thanks to the pandemic. But there were times during the Aquino administration that the negative shocks were enough to um, render the performance suboptimal during the early years of the Aquino administration. And then they were able to do something about it. So think of it this way. So that's reflected by the movements in this shock. And of course, you have the pandemic, and then the government was really involved. Okay, so that explains this one. But then in here, well, it's too early to tell. Okay, it's too early to tell. But then there are no significant consumption shocks. So here, but then people, I think they're more focused on investments because there's this uptick in the government investment shock in the current administration. This I think is associated with the bill. Okay. And then if you take a look at this, you will feel a bit disappointed because you may ask the question, how come that you have a profile that looks like this? Is it possible that you just have a shock that keeps increasing? Well, it's not possible. Okay, so that highlights the temporal reactions of the macroeconomy to various shocks that affect it in the short run. Okay, and then in here, this is the monetary policy shock. It's because if you look at the monetary policy, the data on policy rate, it's not that variable. Okay, but then it adjusts, meaning they're more conscious. They are quite active in anticipating plausible sources of negative shocks. This is associated with inflation, right? When they try to combat inflation, so there are policy effects being um, thrown our way coming from advanced economies, particularly the US, and then we have to contend with inflation here as well. Okay, so that explains the significant increase in the policy rate. But then in here, so you have domestic risk premium. So that says something about the risk associated with domestically issued bonds. And what can you say? So I think we're good. Okay, we're good. It means that it doesn't reflect a sad or challenging reality. But then if you take a look at this, there were times during the Aquino administration that the risk premium shock was positive. Okay. So you have also productivity shocks. The only takeaway here is that this one is more volatile compared to the permanent productivity shock. Okay. Okay. 5 minutes. Last 5 minutes, I will try to speed up. Now, if you ask the question, do policy shocks have a significant effect on output growth? It's not persistent. Okay, so this one is for shocks coming from government investments, shocks coming from consumption, and then the policy rate. Of course, if you increase the policy rate, then there goes your economic growth performance. What about price inflation. So this one is a monetary policy shock and sudden increase in the interest rate. It reduces price inflation, domestic price inflation. That's okay, right? But then what does government investment shocks do? They also play a role in mitigating, but then it may take a while before impacts can be ascertained. And the same is true for CPI-based inflation, you increase interest rate, and then, of course, with sudden reduction in inflation. But then in here, you can also see how government investments may be able to mitigate inflation. So for persistence, the most persistent fiscal policy tool is the one associated with transfers, and this one deals with social security taxes paid by firms. Okay. And then for monetary policy, complementarities, you have 0.6 and then 0.87. How do you analyze this or interpret the closer to zero? It means that you have more complementarity. Okay. So, and then you have monetary policy for those who are interested. You may verify what these estimates mean. Okay, so persistence is evident, so that's 0.98. And then the Taylor coefficient of inflation is similar to other estimates. And there's this result showing that the response to change in inflation is less than the response of interest rate to changes in output. And is government spending cyclical or counter-cyclical? So based on this, it's counter-cyclical. Government investment is pro-cyclical, which is good. And government transfers is counter-cyclical. And then they all of this respond negatively to increases in the public debt. And yeah, so the model was also able to estimate the um, standard deviations of shocks, which is not easy. Okay. Okay, so I reached the last slide of today's presentation. So these are just some takeaways. The model yields parameter estimates that are, well, I think they are insightful in characterizing optimal behavior, the extent of describing the extent of stabilization policies to us, and then anticipating the consequences. So second, the model has uncovered dynamics worth focusing on. So that's the reason why I focus on the questions that was shown earlier. And then the third one, the model yielded estimates for parameters, well, that may be hard to pin down using traditional methods. Okay. Okay. Anyway, I will stop here. I think I spent a lot of time discussing some of the trivial aspects of the presentation. So thank you very much, Dr. Magante. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Dakuikoy, for the timely and enlightening lecture. So we are now approaching our Q&A segment. We are encouraging participants to please raise their hands or type their questions in our chat box. Dr. Dakuikoy gave us a very extensive and very clear, by the way, explanation of his work. So thank you, sir. Oh, sir, we do have one question here from Mr. R. Aquila. Hello, sir. Why do policymakers still rely on simplistic models despite advancement in DSGE modeling?
Oh, okay. Thank you very much for your question. This is actually relevant. It's because if you present something like this before policymakers, they will simply stand up and walk away from your presentation. And that is something that we acknowledge as researchers. So we have to present results that may appeal to them, that require less math. But as I mentioned a while ago, this is just one of the tools. So if they would still rely on simpler methods, that's okay, right? But then what you're going to do if you know how to model the same phenomenon using another methodology, you get the results and then try to replicate, try to come up with a way to verify whether the results are accurate. Yeah. But that's a very good question.
Thank you, Dr. Dakuikoy.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry.
sorry. Say
Sorry,
it's
ma'am. Okay.
Miss
Yeah.
Akila. You Miss Akila for that. Do we have any other questions aside from that wonderful question from Miss Akila? Anybody from our audience? Please feel free to raise your hands. I see some of my students here, so very good. Ayan. And so far we have none.
Mhm.
So far we have none. Magaling mag-explain si Dr. Dakoy-koy.
Mahirap lang. Yun. Yeah, anyway, so
Yeah. So, sir, I do have a small clarification regarding the images on fiscal shocks.
oh
Sir,
yeah.
could you elaborate on the observed volatility in government investments and consumption during the pandemic period, as shown in the two figures?
Okay, so let me
Specifically, yeah, specifically, sir, what were the key drivers of these significant fluctuations?
well, I think the during the pandemic we have a lot of lockdowns. And
Mm-hmm.
then initially, I think the government decided to shut down a lot of economic activities. So that means that workers may not be available, and then you have contractors who are having difficult time sourcing their materials in order to build um, public investment projects or public infrastructure projects. So that I think may be partly responsible for the relative volatility of government investments. But we also have to realize that disbursements matter. The rate at which funds are being disbursed will also determine the, the state of government investments. It's because, during the pandemic, of course, we only focus on essential services. Manufacturing plants focus on essential items. So that may have impacted the ability of contractors to finish government projects during that time. And also, I think, when you talk about investments, investments are traditionally more volatile than output. So yeah. But then that's a very good question. What are the drivers? So I was only able to offer some practical interpretations, I guess. But that can be formally studied. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. And we have time for one final question from Miss Akela. Why do DSGE models struggle to accurately predict fiscal policy outcomes in complex economies?
Um, yeah, it's one of the I think the challenges that face DSG modelers. It's because the model only admits limited heterogeneity, for instance, but then in the real world, you're talking about different household type, different individuals. So you're just focus on, let's say, educational attainment, and then the type of household, the type of what else, the jobs, occupations. Okay, so it may not properly reflect the mechanisms or the pathways through which a fiscal policy shock may affect the other components of the model. So it's one of the, well, I'm not going to to say that DSG models are perfect, but then that's one of the more important challenges that need to be address. It's because the model is based on the representative agent assumption. There may be other, you know, uh, features that should have been there, but then uh, apparently they're not. So that may also affect the ability of the model to capture what's actually happening on the ground. So, and more importantly, um, the the model relies on a stationary environment. So meaning the data that are matched with the model variables must be stationary simply because the model variables in the DSG model are log linearized. So which means that these are mean zero variables. So So that's the reason why when you're going to gather data, you have to transform them into growth rates because you're going to match the observables expressed as growth rates to the model variables, which are also stationary. So that may be one of the reasons why it's a bit hard to match some of the predictions coming from the model to what we actually observe based on the data.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dakoy, for that thorough explanation. On behalf of everyone here, we do sincerely thank our speakers, Dr. Dakoy, for sharing their knowledge and insights with us today. So your contributions have made this seminar both enlightening and inspiring. We truly appreciate the time and effort you put into making this event a success. Once again, Dr. Dakoy, we thank you.
Okay, so
So
thank you very much. And also to
Salamat, sir. Please, we invite you to visit the website for materials from previous seminars. And also, previous seminar series videos can be found in the Ateneo de Manila University YouTube page with a playlist titled Economics Seminar Series. So you can watch everything there. For those of for those or other audiences, please, you can have the request form for the certificates, and the link can be found on the chat box as Danny had inputted it there. So please answer immediately as it is only open for 2 hours after the session. And finally, we do thank our support team for making all of this possible, Miss Danny Andres, Mr. Lance Batara, Mr. Kenneth Arno Noble, and finally, Mr. Rodel Crisostomo. We request for our audience and everybody to please open their cameras for picture taking, courtesy of Danny.
Yes, well, hello. Also, we'll have the two slides on my screen. So let's just take two photos. Okay, hope you're all ready. I'll give it 2 more seconds for everyone to turn on their cameras. Or if you can't turn on their cameras, that's fine. Just do a Zoom react. Okay, taking the first photo in 3, 2, 1. Okay, give me just a moment. And taking the second photo in 3, 2, 1. Okay, that's good. Thank you po,
Okay,
Doc
thank you very
Mayor.
much, Danny. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Dakoy. Thank you
Okay,
to
thank
all
you. Thank you.
to all our audience.